the Socialist Strategy and Workers' Resistance in the Pandemic. We're going to have a panel with 5 speakers, and then have a little time for discussion and Q&A, and then the speakers will wrap up. My name is Erica West. I'm a social worker and socialist. I live in Oakland, and I'm a member of East Bay DSA. Yeah, and if you haven't already, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say a little bit about yourself. So this meeting was organized by the Tempest Collective, a brand new revolutionary socialist organizing project. Their website hopes to be one of many places for open debate and strategic discussions facing activists in the new socialist movement. It is towards that goal that we're holding these webinars. The first one was a month ago on socialists and the anti-racist uprising. There's actually, I think, a transcript on that on Tempest's website. I wonder if someone could drop the link in the chat. That was really great. And I think it's on Facebook Live still too. I really enjoyed that event. So there'll be more information on how to get involved in Tempest later in the call, but if you have suggestions or ideas for a future discussion topic, you can reach out to the comrades. I'm gonna drop their email right here. Yeah, so if people have thoughts or topic ideas, definitely share them so we can have more events like this in the future. So like I said at the beginning, we're gonna have 5 speakers. They're each gonna talk for about 10 minutes. And once all 5 of them have spoken, then we'll open it up to discussion. So our first speaker is Nacho, and he has some translation assistance. Is that right? Are they on the call, Natalia? Okay, great. So I'm just going to introduce him really quick before they get started. So Nacho is a Vermont farm worker and organizer with Migrant Justice. Migrant Justice is a grassroots farm worker founded and led organization in Vermont, which works to build the voice, capacity, and power of the farm worker community and engage community partners to organize for economic justice and human rights. So Nacho, if you and your translators want to unmute yourselves, and you all can take it away.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es José Ignacio. Soy trabajador de un rancho lechero y parte del Comité de Coordinación de Justicia Migrante.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Jose Ignacio. I'm a worker in a dairy farm, and I'm part of the Coordination Committee of Migrant Justice. And my name is Marita, and I'll be interpreting for him.
Somos una organización creada y liderada por inmigrantes que defienden los derechos humanos de los trabajadores en el estado de Vermont, que es frontera con Canadá. Aquí la mayoría de los ranchos son pequeños, más o menos por promedio de 5 trabajadores por rancho, para sostener la industria lechera. Es un estado donde los ranchos están aislados y es muy difícil estar conectados.
We are an organization created and led by immigrants defending the human rights of the workers in the state of Vermont, which is a border state with Canada. Here, the majority of the farms are small. There is around 5 to 7 workers per farm, sustaining the dairy industry. This is a state where the farms are isolated. It's very difficult to go out and to keep connected.
Somos uno de los pocos estados donde tenemos derecho a una licencia de conducir. Hemos ganado la ley No Más Polimigra, donde la policía no puede colaborar con el Departamento de Migración. También lideramos un programa de leche continuidad.
We are one of the few states where you have the right to get a driver's license regardless of your immigration status. We have won the No Más Polimigra law, the fair and impartial policing policy, where the police cannot collaborate with immigration enforcement. We are also leading the Milk with Dignity program.
Es un programa con estándares creado por los trabajadores de los ranchos lecheros, que son viviendas justas, sueldos dignos, días de enfermedad pagados, protección para no ser discriminado, ni despedido sin causa justa.
Milk with Dignity is a program with standards created by workers in the dairy farms. Some of the standards are dignified wages, fair housing, paid sick days, protections to not be discriminated, or fired without just cause.
Queremos expandir el programa Leche con Dignidad, invitando a la compañía Hannaford a que se una hoy en día. Se necesita este programa más que nunca, porque nosotros los trabajadores no hemos parado de trabajar antes ni durante la pandemia del COVID-19.
We want to expand this program, the program Milk with Dignity, inviting Hannaford supermarkets to join the program. Today, a program like this is needed more than ever because we, the workers, haven't stopped working during this pandemic of COVID-19.
También le estamos pidiendo al gobierno el apoyo económico, porque solo nos llaman esenciales y no somos reconocidos como ellos lo mencionan. Estamos liderando una campaña legislativa en el estado para que sean equitativos y llegue el apoyo del gobierno a la comunidad migrante que trabaja en ranchos, hospitales, restaurantes, hoteles y campos, donde más se necesita.
We're also asking the government for economic support. They are calling us essential, but they don't recognize us as they mention it. We are leading a legislative campaign in the state asking equity so the support of the government can come to the all immigrant community working in farms, hospitals, restaurants, hotels, other fields where it's more needed.
Seguimos luchando y estamos colaborando con más organizaciones para terminar el racismo y la discriminación que en estos meses se ha hecho más visible.
We're still fighting, we're still in the struggle. We also are collaborating with other organizations to end racism and discrimination. All these months, racism and discrimination has been more visible.
El impacto de la pandemia a nuestra comunidad nos ha afectado ahora y a largo plazo, aunque no han habido compañeros y compañeras enfermos. El hecho de que los ranchos se están cerrando y ahora han cambiado y las horas han cambiado, significa que la comunidad puede perder su trabajo y con ello su vivienda. Queremos un cambio más profundo.
The impact of the pandemic in our community, it's affecting us now and also at long term. Even that we haven't had higher cases of compañeros and compañeras getting sick, the fact that the farms are closing and the schedules are changing and decreasing, it means that the community can lose their jobs and with that, their housing situation. That is why we want a deeper change.
Ahora la organización ha recibido donaciones para apoyar económicamente a los trabajadores lecheros.
So right now, Migrant Justice has received donations to support economically workers in the dairy farms.
Pero deben de saber que somos miles de trabajadores que trabajan en diferentes industrias.
But you all have to know that there are more immigrants besides the dairy farm workers.
Y no se ha podido llenar la demanda.
So it's impossible to fill out this demand for support.
Por eso estamos pidiendo un cambio verdadero.
And that's why we're asking for a real change.
Gracias por escuchar.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you all for sharing. That was really wonderful. And thanks for joining us today. Our next speaker is going to be Natalia. Natalia is a member of the Tempest Collective and an unemployed restaurant worker, and she is one of the founders of DSA's Restaurant Organizing Project and a member of DSA in New York City. Natalia, why don't you take it away?
Hey everyone, I'm really happy to be here having this discussion. I think as Nacho explains, the COVID crisis is hitting every industry and changing work in every industry, but also interacting with the existing conditions of those industries and producing new necessary fightbacks because of those connections. I'm going to focus on the food service industry. I've been a restaurant worker for more than 15 years. I'm currently unemployed along with many millions of others. It's one of the industries that's been hardest hit by COVID-19. We're 10% of the workforce, but we make up 40% of unemployed. Those in the restaurant industry who are deemed essential workers have faced an immediate deterioration of their conditions, having to go to work in the face of a pandemic, but also there's incredible shortages of staff, less people asked to be doing new work and asked to be cleaning and not being given extra pay for that. And it's definitely the lowest paid sectors of the industry that are more likely to be deemed essential workers, concentrated in fast food and in immigrant communities. The current crisis is hitting the most precarious industries the hardest. And it's different compared to the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, when the bulk of job loss was actually in the higher paid, more professional jobs. What's happening now is that actually it's the lowest paid jobs that are being disproportionately impacted by unemployment. This isn't a coincidence. It's because almost all of the job creation that happened since the Great Recession of 2008 was in the service sector, in jobs that were part-time, that didn't offer security, that didn't offer benefits. In the restaurant industry specifically, it represented 84% of job growth between 2010 and 2018. It grew at a rate 3 times faster than the overall economy. So what that means is that there are new large concentrations of workers in one of the most precarious industries, and it's the exact industry that's being disproportionately impacted by COVID and unemployment. It's the existing precarity in the industry that has hit workers so hard because of COVID. The restaurant industry is the least organized industry in the country. 1.3% of restaurant workers are organized compared to 10% overall. The existing conditions at work have affected the shape of the crisis. It's an industry where people don't have health care. Usually it's not offered by an employer, but even when it is, they'll keep you just below the number of hours that would allow them, that would mean you would be eligible for them. In restaurants, you don't get sick days, which means that if you are sick with COVID, you pretty much have to go to work anyway. And I know that seems really extreme and the law says otherwise, but I know that this is happening. There's no salary, so it impacts what unemployment looks like for immigrant workers who, despite doing enormous amounts of work and paying in to taxes from their paychecks, aren't eligible for any of the benefits. And people who work for tips have no salary. So that means that you might not have a declared income, which is what unemployment is based on in most cities. You're unlikely to have savings because for the most part you work shift to shift, and there's no really ability to plan ahead because the restaurant industry comes in kind of fits and starts of business. So I think for restaurant workers, it feels right now that it's like, if you do have a job, you don't want to risk losing that job. So you'll be more compelled to feel like you have to risk COVID in order to go to work. And if you don't have a job, you're like, am I ever going to have a job again? Are these jobs ever going to come back? And I do think that dynamic was tempered for sections of the industry, the more fortunate sections of the industry that were able to get unemployment, including the CARES Act. That sense of hopelessness was maybe tempered for a little while, delayed, but it's definitely coming back in full force. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So despite the bleak picture that I just went through, COVID-19 has also led to new and revitalized struggles in the restaurant industry. There's been a wave of workplace actions, in particular when COVID hit, workers organizing to make sure that their bosses closed, even though they had no intention of doing so. There have been union drives, some of which have been successful, some of which have won and resulted in the closures of businesses, which is a marking of trying to organize in the restaurant industry. And there's also been Black Lives Matter actions that have happened in many workplaces in the restaurant industry. And it was in looking at the concentration of workers that I described in the restaurant industry and at the new battle over conditions and norms that is reshaping, immediately reshaping the conditions of life and work for workers in the industry, that some people in DSA started talking about launching a restaurant organizing project. And it's a project that's through the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, which is the National Labor Commission of the DSA. It came together because workers, industry workers and labor activists started seeing something new happening in the industry. This industry has been very isolating. The majority of people work in very, very small shops where 9 in 10 restaurants have less than 50 employees. So you're talking about people scattered across lots of tiny workplaces. But what this crisis did was it threw every single one of the millions of restaurant workers into a shared condition all at once, all together. So we felt like there was opportunities to actually have some of those discussions across our different small workplaces. So the restaurant organizing project, what we try to do is to use the infrastructure and resources of the Democratic Socialists of America to build organization of restaurant workers. It's by no means the only restaurant worker organization that exists. There's actually a proliferation of lots of different ones that are popping off, workers' centers, organizations, unions, and our organization is not just for DSA members, but what we hope to do is to make resources that will make it as easy as possible and allow as many workers in the industry as possible to act. So we have a compilation of Know Your Rights documents, different documents that go through kind of different forms of organizing, minority unions versus industry-wide demands versus unemployment demands versus a traditional union drive. And our organization is built around bi-weekly trainings and discussions that take up what are very historic challenges that have prevented big successes in organizing the restaurant industry over time, and tries to develop strategies that can work past those pitfalls. Our goal is to break down the isolation that characterizes the industry, the divisions that characterize the industry between immigrant and citizen, between front of house and back of house, and to try to build collectives that can give people a sense of a base of operation across all of our tiny workplaces, all of our individualized misery of being unemployed, and try to organize as workers together in our industry. There's 3 main things that activity has looked like recently. One is unemployed organizing. As I said, it's the industry that has, it's the industry that is, has been impacted the hardest by unemployment. There's a coalition called Restaurant Workers United that brings different groups together and has organized 3 days of action to demand the extension and the expansion of the federal benefits. So that would mean that the CARES Act has expired. There's so many people who have relied on those benefits who are now basically thrown out to dry, like being left out to dry. Evictions are now starting up again. And there's a desire to try to build organization around demands that would fight for unemployment relief. The second thing is support for chapters who are trying to build local organizations of restaurant workers. So there's different groupings right now we have 19 cities where there's chapters in some stage of development. And we also do specific campaigns so that like if workers reach out to us that they're trying to unionize and they have a question, or they've been fired in retaliation, sorry, that's my next one. Never mind that one. We collaborate with the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, which is another DSA labor initiative, to follow up with people who are trying to figure out how to organize in restaurants and how to tackle the particularities that affect people who try over and over again to get past some of the barriers that exist. And the third thing that we've been doing is emergency response. The most common thing that happens in the restaurant industry when you organize is that you get fired or your restaurant closes. And that has been happening. It will continue to happen. And so, for example, in Boise, Idaho, workers were fired for trying to organize around safety, and they were they launched a campaign to demand their jobs back. They have a pending NLRB ruling, and we were mobilizing to have people pressure the workplace from all across the country. One thing we did was write bad Yelp reviews about why, like, we're not going to order pizza from a union busting shop, and everything we could to make the workers feel like there was a broader network of people that had their back. The hope is that we can use all of this activism to develop our arguments and work through the challenges that are not easy to overcome, and brace ourselves for what we know are going to be very turbulent times ahead. But that this is a moment when we could actually use this moment to get more organized. I want to finish just with a couple of strategic things that I've been thinking about that I think may be generalizable to other people doing organizing in other industries. The first is that even though we understand that the working class is the agent of social change, that doesn't always mean that the immediate first step is always going to be something targeting a shop floor. I think that in the restaurant industry, there are structural barriers to doing so that I've already gone through, and that a lot of times at our workplaces, we feel atomized and hopeless and like we're up against the entire world. And when you start to think about, like, what are some of the actual industry-wide things that could be put in place so that you're not just leaving one job to go to another job that has exactly the same conditions, but actually forcing, like, for example, one of the things that's been coming up a lot in the restructuring that's happening because of COVID is the questions about the tipping system. The sub-minimum wage for tipped workers is still $2.13 an hour. It's actually a relic of slavery. The tipping system is incredibly archaic and is something that overturning that would change the structural relationship of workers in the industry. The other thing is just that actually things that happen in the world have a huge impact on whether people feel confident to organize at the workplace. COVID is the most important example, where it's like all of a sudden, like, people are being asked to go to work for incredibly low wages and risk their health, risk their lives. And it raised all the questions of precarity and organization and why are things structured that way. The other one is the Black Lives Matter uprising. I just want to give two really quick examples. In Athens, Ohio, there were 2 instances of workers, in one case, refusing to fulfill a large to-go order for cops during the height of the uprising, and in another instance, refusing to honor the discount for cops and fighting to have that overturned as a store policy. There was also a very successful union drive that just happened in Minneapolis last week, Tattersall Brewery. It's the first unionized craft brewery in the country, and they won. And part of their impetus for developing their campaign was linking workplace demands with anti-racist demands at the height of the pandemic and fighting around affirmative action. And it was one of the ways that they were able to build community support. I wanted to mention also a little bit the issue of unemployment, because I think that it's contradictory. Like, people who were eligible for the CARES Act money were making more money on unemployment than they were at their jobs. So you had this situation where, on the one hand, there's these raised expectations around, like, oh, everyone should be entitled to a living wage, which $600 a week is $15 an hour full time, and you don't make that at your job. And then on the other hand, that money's gone, and we're being told that we're supposed to go back to jobs that don't exist and settle for much less. So on the one hand, it's raised expectations. On the other hand, the question of, like, where and how you would fight for that to be a reality has to be developed, because it's not just going to be automatic. Even though the economy depends on the millions of unemployed workers participating in the economy, clearly there's inaction on the part of the government, and it just kind of shows that if they wanted to carry through and provide things like that, they could, because they just did it during the CARES Act. So it's raised expectations in a way that I think provides opportunities for continued organizing. I think there are some questions about how to do unemployed organizing, and understanding that it's going to be a factor in our period for the time to come. It's not just going to go away. We're not going back to how things were before. And I have noticed that it feels like when we do meetings, it feels like the meetings that we do that are more around workplace trainings are more popular than the meetings we do around unemployed organizing. And it's just something that I'm thinking about. I think the reality is that unemployed organizing can't be separated from workplace organizing. If you're a restaurant worker, you're like, I'm scared. The most common thing is I'm scared to organize because I'm worried I'm going to get fired. So if there's an unemployed movement that makes people feel like you're not going to be totally alone if you do get fired, that there's going to be groupings of people who are going to organize and make sure that people are provided for, it makes it more likely that workplace organizing could be successful. And on the other hand, the main bludgeon that they have is to say, there's a million people who want this job, take it or leave it. Ultimately, I think like some kind of demand around like a hiring hall or something that allows workers to determine who and how gets hired at different shops is one vision for how to address something like that. But I just think in general, unemployed organizing is an integral part of working class struggle, and we need to figure out how to develop demands and how to exert mass pressure along those lines. The full weight of the crisis has not yet hit, but the immigrant community in restaurants has been hit the hardest, both because they can't access unemployment benefits, jobs are closing, you're more likely to be an essential worker who's at risk for COVID, but also because you're more likely to be in precarious housing that has no lease, where you're not actually counted in as being part of the moratorium on evictions. And there was an article in Eater this week that went through the crisis and what it looks like in Corona, Queens. And I highly recommend people read it because it has to be, just the whole question of the divisions in our industries, the divisions that exist and how they try to pit immigrant workers from US born workers against each other and front of house against back of house. Like these are things that have to be at the center of any strategy for organizing in the restaurant industry. And I'll just wrap up. I think that what we're trying to do is an experiment, and it's a question of, can we develop worker-driven demands to fight around as our industry inevitably consolidates and restructures because of this crisis? And can we integrate unemployed demands with workplace demands and start to think about the industry as a whole and what it should look like and what it could look like if workers had an answer to that question? And I think if we don't get ourselves organized and if we don't try to figure out how to overcome the obstacles that we know exist, the bosses are going to figure out an answer for that, and it's not going to be pretty. So I think that people in every industry are starting to think through some of these questions, and I really hope that we can use this catastrophic, miserable, horrible moment to organize ourselves so that when this crisis continues and as it continues, we can have stronger workers' organizations to respond to things that are necessary to respond to. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Natalia. That was really great. If you have a link for the restaurant organizing project, maybe drop it in the chat so people who are interested can get connected and involved. Really quick before we move on to our next speaker, our translator in the chat asked that people try to speak a little bit more slowly to help her with the translation. So just for our speakers going forward and when we open up Stack, just be mindful of that we have translation going on. So our next speaker is Jonathan. He is the co-chair of Queens DSA and a co-founder of Amazonians United in New York City. He was recently derided as a socialist at the RNC, and he's working to build community control of police. So Jonathan, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome, thank you. So, okay, I'm notoriously nervous when I'm speaking and will easily start rambling a little bit. So if there are any questions that come up to people in their minds or like, hey, I wanna know more about this, feel free to like, you know, jump in the chat and like type in like thoughts there, you know. So I'm gonna just kind of like go through a little bit of like what we've done kind of so far as Amazonians United, kind of over this period, you know, with the crisis of the virus, some of our responses to it as Amazonians United, kind of a little bit of our like thinking in terms of like organizing the unorganized as opposed to working within you know, an already organized space, and kind of some of its relevance to Black liberation in general, and kind of how that like helps us kind of see where we can go from here. So first of all, you know, we as Amazonians United New York City, we went live actually just right before you know, we started to really like ratchet up with the crisis of the virus. And we were fortunate to be in a position where we were just really starting to come together, particularly in the warehouse I'm in here in Queens, New York, around demands that actually included sick pay and paid time off. Amazon denied us our right to safe and sick leave under New York City law, of course. And they also denied us access to paid time off that is actually promised to Amazon workers. So we actually kind of focused a lot of our efforts around that, helping people recognize both that our rights were being violated, and that it would actually take us applying pressure as workers to win not only just our rights, but also if we wanted to push for the things that we were promised, but we were being denied. So that as that was coming together, the real effects of the virus hit, and we kind of like also layered on pushes to really create spaces for Amazon workers nationally to come together and launch this large national campaign around demands specifically to address issues with the virus. We were able to kind of leverage our connections through DSA to fundraise, and we were actually able to get Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to support our demands and to actually contribute to like our fundraising efforts so that we could actually more easily facilitate building shop floor power. In conjunction with an action where we shut down the warehouse in response to there being an incident of the virus that Amazon tried to ignore, and a walkout shortly after that, we were able to win our safe and sick leave and win paid time off for our coworkers. And really, it's important not to minimize the fact that that is really something that came out of our efforts nationwide. Amazonians United chapters all over the US pushing for paid time off. You know, for us, that was a really big deal because that you know, for a lot of workers, that's a couple weeks of paid time that you know, where they don't have to be at work. They can, whether they're sick or just honestly, anybody who works at Amazon always needs a break. So that was like a really, really powerful thing for us and really helped establish a lot of legitimacy as well. It also like exposed a lot of interesting things for us in terms of our relationship to the shop floor, because we're not within a unionized workplace, we're really just us and our coworkers fighting for change of conditions, it really became essential that we're building deep, that we're really building relationships, one-on-one relationships with as many of our coworkers as possible, so that we could have a deep amount of engagement in whatever kinds of actions that we were doing. We really had to kind of step away from the current, like right now, the current popular method of engaging with Amazon is through mobilizing. There's like a lot of activities where, you know, well, where there will be around, especially with activist organizations, to like really turn people out, create like a very visual event, but not necessarily reaching that deep and full worker participation that's necessary to actually do something like shut down a warehouse. And so we've like really, when we're like trying to think about the methodology that we're taking, we've really been focusing on how much actual engagement do we have with this set amount of people, and focusing on that as the method for, you know, knowing whether we can actually do an action that will be meaningful or not. Yeah, moving away from just mobilizing and really focusing on organizing and developing participation within our set group of people. For us in Amazon, and especially in like within cities, you know, warehouses that are close to cities, this is extremely important to our strategy as socialists overall, because as we know right now, there's not the type of engagement, especially within Black America, that is necessary for us to build a robust socialist movement that actually prioritizes anti-colonialism in its endeavors. For us, though, we look at our warehouse and we know that this is where capitalism puts Black people. You know, though Black folks don't, within New York, Black folks are not 80% of New York City, but our warehouse has been as high as about 90% Black. When we look to see where does capitalism put Black people, it's Amazon is one of those places. So one of the things that we can actually do to ensure that our socialist movement is able to be drawing from the working class and drawing its ranks from colonized peoples is focusing on the workplaces in which capitalism puts colonized peoples. And through working in those spaces and ensuring that we're focusing on actually organizing and developing deep participation within our movement, we can actually do a lot more to affect the class composition of our socialist spaces. One of the things that kind of where this kind of merged for us was during Juneteenth. You know, we held a Juneteenth event that really kind of focused on our relationship to policing. Many folks know that Amazon has a lot of deep connections with policing. One of the Homeland Security officials actually said that they don't think there's been a tighter relationship between the private sector and government since World War II. And that, I think, should be like, we should, as socialists, we should be like deeply concerned about that, because it means that Amazon is actually taking on more and more aspects of state power. And for us as socialists who need to not only be contesting the power of capitalists, but also the power of the state, you know, Amazon is one of those places where it's getting very blurry for what is, where the state begins and ends, and private ownership begins and ends. And you can see this in some concrete moves in which Amazon is taking on, not just through partnerships with police departments, through surveillance systems like Ring, right? In which police just have complete access to like video footage of like neighborhoods, right? But also even through the way that Amazon is doing its hiring. Amazon likes to take on ex-military officials or like FBI agents. For me, I was actually interrogated after one of our actions by somebody who started off the hour-and-a-half interrogation by informing me that he was an ex-FBI officer for 25 years. I mean, it's a very, very clear connection, right? When Black liberation activists that are in the workplace can end up being interrogated in the workplace by police officers or those who have all of that experience, but instead of it being exercised by the state, it's exercised by private interests. We can see like the lines are becoming very blurry of where and what is private ownership and what's state power. And so for us during Juneteenth, that was a big thing that we focused on with a vigil where we actually opened up the opportunity for all of our coworkers and folks from the community to discuss and kind of connect the way that, there's this deep history within America of capitalist exploitation, on plantations, connecting that history to the way that Amazon exploits our labor inside the warehouse, but also financially benefits from the violence that is executed on us by police outside of the warehouse. And so that's been like a very powerful thing, especially when we're talking about how do we connect labor struggles to our struggles to fight against the violence that's executed on Black folks. So like to sum some of this up, I would just say that a lot of these pieces just demonstrate that it's necessary to make sure that we're organizing the unorganized to capture the spaces where capitalism puts colonized peoples. And also, if we want to create new links within workplaces to more effectively mobilize for fights outside of the workplace, it's just, it's essential for us to like build deep, to actually be connecting people to struggle that haven't been before, to like make sure that in those spaces we are doing the work of organizing as opposed to just mobilizing. And that if we can do that, then we should be able to build a robust apparatus for us to build socialism and to fight both inside and outside our workplaces. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was really, really great. I appreciated that. Yeah, Amazon is bad, evil. Okay, so next we're actually going to have Dave Zirin, and then we'll wrap up with Kirstin Roberts, and then we'll go into the discussion and people can share their thoughts and questions. So Dave Zirin is the sports editor for The Nation magazine. He has written 10 books on the politics of sports, and he's the co-host of the radio show The Collision with Eaton Thomas on Pacifica's WPFW in Washington, D.C. In addition, he hosts the Edge of Sports podcast. So Dave, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much. I'll talk slowly for the folks translating. And thanks so much for having me. I'm a late addition to this panel, and I really appreciate the organizers of it at Tempest seeing what's happening in sports as a part of what's happening in the broader labor movement. And what's happening in sports, if I could do this talk in one sentence, I would just say, we're a hell of a long way from freaking out over somebody taking a knee. This story of what's happening in sports right now is a story of inspiration and efforts at co-optation. And it's a story that's being written in pencil, not pen. In other words, it's a story that still does not have an ending. And we should be wary of anyone who thinks they have an ironclad analysis of what is happening right now, because so much is up in the air. But if we want to understand what's happening in the world of sports, if we want to understand what's happening in what I would call a sports strike wave against racism, it starts by understanding the impact of the police murder of George Floyd, which led to the most important social uprising in decades and the largest series of marches in the history of the United States. It's, of course, a social uprising that's been met with terrible violence by both police and by both extra-legal militias in league with the police. Now, the NBA and WNBA players argued back in June about whether they should play in this COVID-free bubble in Orlando and finish out the season in that manner, or if they should just sit out the season so as not to distract from the demonstrations in the streets. That was a debate that played out very openly and very publicly. Do we go back and play, or do we stay out? And by going back and play, are we drawing attention away from the urgent questions of police violence and white supremacy? Well, they went back, but to get them to go back, the league had to appease the players, and they did so by incorporating Black Lives Matter into their business model. I mean, people who have seen the games know what I'm talking about. Black Lives Matter is written on the court. You have players kneeling during the anthem. You have slogans on the backs of players that say things like, say her name and equality, and for some reason, education reform is a popular one. I'm still haven't heard anyone say what they're really talking about there. And, you know, we can call this whatever we want to call it. We can call it woke capitalism, if you like. We can call it woke marketing, if you like. But it was corporate symbolism in the model of so many corporations and businesses that put out statements against racism following the killing of George Floyd. But then after the police shooting of Jacob Blake, that contradiction just became too intense. Players in the NBA and the WNBA, which it must be said, the WNBA has led on all of these political questions from the beginning. These players living in this bubble, away from family and friends, living in dorms, being in close political dialogue with one another, they felt like chumps. They felt like absolute chumps. What they were saying to each other is, here we are playing with Black Lives Matter on the court, Black Lives Matter on our uniforms, and nothing changes. You know, we feel like fools, acting like we're actually doing something when all we're doing is living in both a figurative and a literal bubble. It just became too much. So the Milwaukee Bucks, and of course, Milwaukee is only 45 minutes away from Kenosha, where Jacob Blake was shot. The Milwaukee Bucks didn't play on Wednesday in their playoff game. And I remember getting text messages from people saying, hey, the Bucks haven't left the locker room. Do you think they're not going to play? And then before I could even process what was happening there, the news came that other NBA teams would then not be playing that evening in their playoff games. Then it went to WNBA teams, and this was all very stirring but not surprising. Then it went to Major League Baseball, which was stunning because there are very few Black Americans play Major League Baseball. Then it went to the NHL, which has even fewer Black Americans playing hockey than even Major League Baseball. Then it went to Major League Soccer. And then Naomi Osaka, the tennis star of Japanese Haitian descent, she said she wasn't going to play in her next tournament. And she said, before I'm an athlete, I am a Black woman. And as a Black woman, I feel as though there are much more important matters at hand that need immediate attention rather than watching me play tennis. I don't expect anything drastic to happen with me not playing, but if I can get a conversation started in a majority white sport, I consider that a step in the right direction. Watching the continued genocide of Black people at the hands of the police is honestly making me sick to my stomach. I'm exhausted of having a new hashtag pop up every few days, and I'm extremely tired of having this same conversation over and over again. When will it ever be enough? And I read that because that sense of daring, of her doing this in the lily white country club world of tennis, but also her sense of exhaustion about what's happening in this country, I think speaks to so many of the sentiments that so many players have made. Now, the sports media, largely because I would argue of their just basic ignorance, immediately branded what was taking place boycotts. Boycotts are taking place across the world of sports, but they're not boycotts. They are strikes. And we should be very clear about that. These athletes are not consumers. They are workers. They are withdrawing their labor from the machine of professional sports, the multi-billion-dollar global machine of professional sports, to protest racism and police violence. Now, some people on the left, and I've been dealing with this a lot, have cynically rolled their eyes at this. After all, these are very wealthy people. This is what I hear. They're not real workers. What are they really sacrificing? You know, and I think raising those questions really misses something very important that the players have already accomplished. Like wherever this goes, whatever happens, whether it peters out or whether it explodes even more, I think we have to recognize that it immediately accomplished three important things. First and foremost, what the players did by going on strike is they immediately recentered the conversation around Jacob Blake and not on anarchists burning cities and all the ways the right has tried to reframe what has happened. Second, they captured people's imagination about labor striking for Black lives and the idea that that could be something real that happens. And three, they gave a sense of hope during a period of profound sadness and helplessness, from the Kenosha shootings to that feeling that we marched after George Floyd's murder, we occupied, and here we are, nothing changes, that feeling of frustration. You know, the fact that after the largest marches in the history of the United States, we're left with Joe Biden, you know, and here is this sense of, wait, no, there's something else that can come out of these marches as well. Now, this is all incredibly important, especially the second point that I said about this idea of labor intervening in the struggle for Black lives. I got half a dozen calls on Wednesday night from labor folk asking how to contact the players. And it was like an electric prod had been put to some of these labor people, because it raised a challenge to labor officialdom that they were hearing from their own members, particularly, not to overgeneralize, but particularly to people in the teaching sphere and in the hospital worker sphere, raising a challenge about how can we as workers, as labor, not be on the sidelines in the fight for Black lives. And as this incredible power was being flexed, as this was happening, as I'm sure people know, even, you know, the forces of co-optation were also working overtime. People, if you've been following the story, you know this, but bosses and sports owners were trying to get out from this and speak of their support for the players. Entire teams started putting out statements and talking about action plans that came out of conversations between management and labor. So instead of players striking, it was teams announcing that they would not be playing in support of Black lives. It was labor and management against racism. That's the way they tried to turn it very quickly. And sometimes there's, you know, really interesting stuff came out of it, like statement from the Baltimore Ravens. We understand that this country was built because of slavery, and the legacy of slavery is something we must confront every day. And it's just like, oh, this is on the Baltimore Ravens website. How interesting. So it said something about how much heat they were feeling that these incredibly conservative entities were putting out these kinds of statements talking about systemic racism, white supremacy, and the need, for example, like the Baltimore Ravens on their letterhead, they spoke about the need to arrest the killers of Breonna Taylor. Just a remarkable development, but also an aspect of the co-optation that also has taken place. And now the players, in an absence of a lead from the broader labor movement, they've been operating in a vacuum, so the dominant strategy has been trying to wrest concessions from ownership to join the struggle for Black lives, like the Baltimore Ravens example. Now, as one could imagine when dealing with billionaires, this has led to tamping down demands, with much of the energy being channeled towards November electoralism, and most notably, people might have heard this, an agreement by NBA owners to open up their stadiums as voting centers this November, this was seen as a victory. And I got to say, in the context of COVID, this is not a small thing as a matter of a basic issue of public health to have voting centers that are wide open, but it's also obviously trying to push this away from a labor direction, a strike direction towards electoralism. Also, there's been a great deal of publicity about the intervention of Barack Obama, talking to LeBron James and Chris Paul, who's the head of the NBA Players Association, and encouraging them to go back to work and use their platform through playing basketball as a way to raise awareness. This is certainly an imperfect echo, I think, historically, of Bobby Kennedy telling the Freedom Riders to stop protesting and instead do voting drives and get tax-free status. And I think this is Obama trying to neutralize struggle, because Obama is a moderate, and this is not a moment that calls for moderation. But that also has some other folks on the left also saying that, you know, that's striking for this is now no longer a story of striking for Black lives, to say that this is a story of co-optation, of selling out, that Obama has ruined what the struggle was. And I would argue that that's also way too wrong and way too quick a reading on this. These athletes, they're not hardened revolutionaries. They're not the freedom riders either, frankly. They're human beings responding to a country that is imploding unto itself. And secondly, their social power, while significant symbolically, is not going to turn back Trumpism and remake America. It's not an industry critical to the functioning of capitalism, unlike the industries we've heard discussed already on this call. We need instead, I think, to be holding up their example to the rest of the labor movement to act with similar urgency to this political moment. We also need to understand that this situation in sports is on a knife's edge. The players now have incredible leverage to use their spotlight, to extract concessions from management, or to go back out on strike again, especially if police and their militia partners aren't brought to heel. And of course, they will not be. They're being actively encouraged by this criminal president. We don't know where this is heading, and we don't really have a compass in trying to figure out where it is headed, because so much of this is historically unprecedented. But what we can have is a compass in judging what we are seeing, and any action that I would argue that lays down a gauntlet that challenges the labor movement to act should be seen as a step forward. Striking for Black lives is now on the table, not as an abstraction, but as a goal worth fighting for. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was really wonderful. And as someone who personally doesn't follow sports, this past week was really, really inspiring. So our last speaker is Kirstin Roberts. So Kirstin is a member of the Chicago Teachers Union and chair of the CTU Early Childhood Committee. This is her 15th year as a preschool teacher in the Chicago Public Schools, and she's been an active socialist since 1984. When she's not busy teaching and doing union work, she's active with the United Working Families in the 50th Ward of Chicago, and is hoping to one day elect a socialist from her neighborhood to the Chicago City Council. I also hope to one day elect a socialist from my neighborhood. Kirstin, why don't you take it away?
Wow, this is a really, really tough act to follow. Thank you so much, Nacho and Natalia and Jonathan and David. Just taking incredible inspiration and many things to think about from your contributions. Thank you so much also to the people who are listening and hopefully will be participating in the discussion really soon. Although it sort of seems like a lifetime ago now, the Chicago Teachers Union began last school year with a contract battle that culminated in an 11-day strike at the end of October. It was really a showdown with a newer mayor, a Black, lesbian, Democratic Party, tough-talking former prosecutor, pitted against educators and parent demands for things like smaller class sizes, increased staffing, you know, like having a nurse in the schools every day in every school, better wages, especially for our lowest paid workers, school workers, and common good demands, what have become known as common good demands, like housing assistance for homeless students. Now, Mayor Lightfoot claimed to publicly sympathize with our demands. Of course, she had to. She campaigned and won the mayoral election based on echoing our demands. But when it came down to it, refused to bargain on almost any of them, stating that there was just no money. So after a very, what turned into a very militant strike, a bitter strike that united the two biggest unions in the Chicago public schools for the first time on the picket line together, and a real outpouring of solidarity from around the country and from around the city, Lightfoot was forced to flip over the proverbial mattress and find that money for many of our demands. We won that strike. That successful militant strike was really the beginning of our school year, and it helps to explain how our school year ended and where we're headed. Now, in the second week of March, same for everybody around the country, when it became really clear that the only course to slowing the spread of COVID was shuttering the schools and the rest of non-essential public and private sector businesses and services, our first known case of COVID appeared in the Chicago public schools, and Lightfoot immediately stood up and said, no way, we're shutting the schools down. The schools will remain open. I'm shipping out cleaning supplies. By the way, those cleaning supplies never arrived. A few days later, she was overruled by our Democratic governor, Governor Pritzker, a billionaire Democratic governor with ties to labor and other traditional Democratic Party constituencies. He shuttered all the schools in Illinois and instituted a statewide stay-at-home order within a couple days of that. Lightfoot was livid, publicly livid, that she had been overruled and that the CTU had somehow triumphed over her again, as if it had anything to do with us. But she really was powerless when the daily infection numbers and death count grew higher and higher. Now, what seemed like it would just be a few weeks at the beginning, sort of an extended weird spring break, during that period, our State Board of Education, under pressure from the Illinois Federation of Teachers, passed an emergency set of guidelines, which allowed the Chicago Teachers Union to then bargain with the Chicago Public Schools, basically securing an agreement through the rest of the spring that guaranteed full pay for every one of our members in return for a reduced workday. Which is pretty amazing when you think about what was happening, the wipeout that was happening in the rest of the economy. In that time, we sort of demanded and led a pretty impressive campaign for things like broadband access and computers, as well as emergency relief for unemployed, PP for hospital workers, eviction moratorium, lots of common good demands. And we were some of the first in the city, and I think some of the first in the country, to begin a series of car caravan protests and socially distanced protests in order to meet some of those demands. The first demonstration I went on, I was told about by the Chicago Teachers Union, was actually for Amazon workers within days of being sent home to shelter in place myself. It really showed in that period that a labor left was growing in Chicago and was beginning to try and get its head around what was the art of organizing in a pandemic, as well as grappling with the absolutely failed state of Trump's capitalist pandemic America. Now, like everywhere else in the world, things began to turn much, much more quickly for the Chicago Teachers Union and for the left in Chicago after the murder of George Floyd. The protests and rebellion that followed his torturous live broadcast execution by cop were immediately seen as something that our union needed to respond to, but how to do so was not clear. There was a good deal of debate. You're going to see, if you follow the Chicago Teachers Union closely, that we are very associated with and publicly supportive of the defund movement, of the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly. But our union focus has been mostly around the issue of getting the cops out of Chicago public schools. We're part of a united front in the city and have been very active in defending the Black and youth-led protest movement. But that has not been easy for the Chicago Teachers Union and has been a heavy lift in some ways, because we do have members of our union. We're not a political party, we're a union, and we have members of our union who are on the wrong side of this moment in history, to be totally upfront with you, and how to stay united against the boss, but also on the right side of history can sometimes feel like a big lift, and I know sometimes looks from the outside like we're moving too slow, but we're fighting the good fight internally as well as externally, I believe. I think all of these struggles really, I just want to say, the rank and file involvement in these movements has been stunning. And I think that really set us up for a fight this summer around winning remote learning, because our numbers of COVID are not under control. The neighborhood I live in has over 12% positivity rate, for instance, and there's sort of a patchwork around Chicago, but the blacker, browner, and poorer you are, the higher your COVID numbers. And the schools have not invested anything in reopening safely. So we fought Lightfoot once again, who insisted the schools would open this fall. We are opening, but we are doing so fully remotely for the beginning of the school year. Moving forward, just to sum up, we're moving into an extremely difficult time for both the formal labor movement, but for the workers' movement and socialist movement more generally. We are facing down a budget evisceration. I don't know if people have seen the reports, I'm sure you have. 48% or 48 states in the United States are reporting drop-offs in revenues of 25% or more. We are going to see a tax on pensions. We are going to see a tax on public services. We are going to see furloughs of workers who thus far have not shown up in the unemployment rolls. We're getting ready. Those attacks are already coming in many states, and they are going to sweep this country over the next year. I think that, there's a depression. There continues to be the threat of COVID. There's a Black Lives Matter uprising. And in the middle of all this, there is an election. And how our movement decides to respond, organize in response to the questions that are being raised by this election, and the kind of solidarity that we build is going to be really crucial moving forward. I think it's important not to underestimate the threat of the right, both electorally and in the streets. But I think let's prepare ourselves moving forward for how are we going to build resistance if we do end up having a Democratic administration in 2021, in January of 2021. What are our demands going to look like? How are we going to hold them to it in the middle of this level of economic crisis? I think those are discussions the labor movement and left are going to have. And by the way, David, I just want to let you know, there are some very formal and exciting discussions having about how to take the example of the WNBA and the rest of the professional athletes, how to take that into the rest of the labor movement. So be looking out for news about potential general strikes for Black Lives Matter in the near future.
Great, thank you, Kirstin. That was awesome. So now we're going to open it up for discussion. People can share questions they have or comments or just thoughts. I know there were some questions